Father Benedict thought hearing the king's confessions would bring him closer to God and power. What he didn't know was that priests who knew royal secrets had the shortest life expectancy in the kingdom, because dead confessors couldn't repeat what they'd heard in the confessional booth, and kings preferred their sins buried with their priests. Welcome to Whispers of History. Before we begin this incredible story of Father Benedict, whose sacred vows once bound him to the darkest secrets of medieval England's most ruthless king, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe that some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, hit that subscribe button and share this story to help us honor those who carried impossible burdens in the shadows of absolute power. The bells of Westminster Abbey were ringing vespers when Father Benedict Whitmore received the summons that would change his life forever, and, though he didn't know it yet, seal his fate as well. A royal messenger, resplendent in the colors of King Edward III, waited in the Abbey's cold stone corridor with a parchment bearing the royal seal. The wax was still warm, pressed with the 3 golden lions that represented absolute authority in medieval England. His Majesty requires your immediate attendance, the messenger announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. You are to come at once to Westminster Palace. Father Benedict's hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal and read the brief but momentous words. By royal command, Father Benedict Whitmore is hereby appointed as personal confessor to His Majesty King Edward III. You will attend our person each morning at prime for the hearing of confession and the administration of spiritual guidance as we require. This appointment is effective immediately and shall continue at our pleasure. At 32 years of age, Benedict had served God faithfully for 12 years since taking his holy vows. He was known throughout the Abbey for his discretion, his theological knowledge, and his absolute dedication to the sanctity of confession. These qualities, he believed, had earned him this unprecedented honor, to serve as spiritual advisor to the most powerful man in England. What Benedict didn't understand was that these same qualities had marked him for death. The position of royal confessor had been vacant for 3 months, ever since Father Aldrich had suffered what the court physicians called a sudden fever of the brain that had killed him within hours of his last private audience with the king. Before Aldrich, there had been Father Matthew, who had allegedly fallen down a flight of stone steps in the palace, breaking his neck in what guards described as a most unfortunate accident. And before Matthew, Father Gregory had supposedly choked on a fishbone during a solitary meal in his chambers, though the kitchen staff swore they had served him nothing but bread and wine that evening. The pattern should have been obvious to anyone paying attention, but the church hierarchy had learned long ago that asking too many questions about the fate of royal confessors was the quickest way to join them in their untimely graves. When kings needed new priests to hear their confessions, the church provided them without inquiring too deeply into what had happened to their predecessors. Benedict gathered his few possessions, his prayer book, his rosary, his ceremonial stole, and the small wooden crucifix that had belonged to his father, and followed the royal messenger through the narrow streets of London to Westminster Palace. The palace loomed against the evening sky like a great stone beast, its towers and battlements silhouetted against the dying light. Guards in chain mail and surcoats bearing the royal arms stood at every gate and doorway, their eyes constantly scanning for threats to the king they served. Inside, the palace was a maze of corridors, chambers, and staircases that seemed to stretch on forever. Tapestries depicting scenes of royal victories covered the stone walls, while elaborate candelabras cast dancing shadows that made the woven figures appear to move and fight in eternal silence. The floors were covered with rushes that rustled underfoot, mixed with herbs that were supposed to ward off disease, but mostly served to mask the less pleasant odors of medieval court life. Benedict was led to a small chamber adjacent to the king's private chapel, a room that would serve as both his quarters and his confessional office. The space was spartanly furnished with a narrow bed, a wooden kneeler, a small table for his books, and a chair where he would sit to hear the king's confessions. A single window looked out onto the palace courtyard, its thick glass distorting the view like a funhouse mirror. "His Majesty will summon you at dawn," the messenger informed him before departing. "You are to be ready at all times to attend him for confession, regardless of the hour. The king's spiritual needs take precedence over all other considerations, including sleep, meals, and prayer." Alone in his new quarters, Benedict knelt before the crucifix and offered a prayer of thanksgiving for this great honor. He prayed for wisdom to guide the king's conscience, for strength to bear whatever burdens confession might reveal, and for the grace to serve both God and crown with equal devotion. He had no way of knowing that he was praying for his own soul's preparation for the journey to the afterlife. The first confession came at dawn, just as the messenger had promised. A soft knock on his door was followed by the entrance of King Edward III himself, a man whose presence seemed to fill the small chamber with an almost palpable sense of power and danger. At 41, Edward was in the prime of his reign, having ruled England for 21 years through war, plague, and political upheaval. His face bore the lines of a man who had made countless life-and-death decisions, and his eyes held the cold intelligence of someone who trusted no one completely and forgave nothing easily. "Father Benedict," the king said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute rule, "I trust you understand the sacred nature of what passes between us in this chamber." "Of course, Your Majesty," Benedict replied, gesturing toward the kneeler. "The seal of confession is inviolate. Nothing you say here will ever pass my lips." Edward smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "I'm counting on that, Father, more than you might realize." The king knelt before the small wooden screen that separated confessor from penitent, and Benedict prepared himself to hear the sins of the most powerful man in England. He expected the usual catalog of royal transgressions: pride, anger, perhaps adultery or gluttony. He was prepared to offer spiritual counsel about the temptations of power and the need for humility before God. He was not prepared for murder. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," Edward began, following the traditional formula. "It has been 1 week since my last confession, and I accuse myself of these sins." What followed was a litany of horrors that would have shocked even the most worldly priest. The king spoke matter-of-factly about ordering the execution of political rivals, about torturing prisoners for information, about arranging accidents for nobles who had grown too powerful or too inconvenient. He described decisions that had led to the deaths of thousands, policies that had deliberately caused famine and suffering in rebellious territories, and personal vendettas that had been satisfied through methods that would have made the devil himself recoil. But it was the casual tone that truly horrified Benedict. Edward spoke of these atrocities as if they were routine administrative matters, necessary evils of governance that required confession only because the Church insisted that all sins be acknowledged, not because he felt any genuine remorse for his actions. "I had Lord Robert of Blackmore poisoned last Tuesday," the king continued conversationally. "He was becoming too popular with the northern barons, and his wife had been asking uncomfortable questions about the treasury. The poison was administered in his wine during what appeared to be a celebratory feast in his honor. Very theatrical, very effective." Benedict's hands were shaking as he struggled to maintain his composure. "Your Majesty," he managed to say, "these are grave matters indeed. Do you feel contrition for these acts?" "Contrition," Edward laughed softly. "Father, I feel satisfaction. These were necessary actions taken for the good of the realm. I confess them not because I regret them, but because confession cleanses the soul and allows me to continue my work unencumbered by spiritual debt." This was not how confession was supposed to work. The sacrament required genuine repentance, a firm purpose of amendment, and sorrow for sins committed. What Edward was describing was not confession, but spiritual money laundering, using the sacrament to clear his conscience, without actually changing his behavior or feeling remorse for his crimes. "My son," Benedict said carefully, "true confession requires contrition, a sincere desire to avoid sin in the future and—" "Father," Edward interrupted, his voice suddenly cold and dangerous, "I am not here for a theology lesson. I am here to confess my sins according to the requirements of Holy Mother Church. You will hear my confession, grant me absolution, and assign whatever penance you deem appropriate. Nothing more, nothing less." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Benedict was not being asked to provide spiritual guidance. He was being commanded to perform a religious ceremony that would allow the king to continue his reign of terror with a clear conscience. He was not a confessor but a spiritual accomplice, using the authority of the church to sanctify acts that would damn any ordinary soul. But what choice did he have? To refuse would be to defy the king directly, an act of treason that would result in immediate execution. To flee would be impossible. Royal confessors were watched constantly, their movements monitored, their contacts scrutinized, and to report what he had heard would violate the sacred seal of confession, damning his own soul even as it accomplished nothing practical. Benedict granted the king absolution and assigned a penance so light as to be meaningless, a few prayers and a small donation to the church. Edward accepted both with the satisfaction of a man conducting a successful business transaction, then rose from the kneeler and prepared to leave. "I trust, Father, that you understand the unique nature of your position," the king said as he moved toward the door. "Royal confessors serve not just God, but England itself. The stability of the realm depends on the king's spiritual health, and the king's spiritual health depends on regular confession and absolution. You are performing a patriotic duty as much as a religious one." After Edward left, Benedict remained kneeling in his small chamber for nearly an hour, struggling to process what he had just experienced. He had entered the king's service, believing he would be helping to guide a Christian monarch toward righteousness and virtue. Instead, he had become an enabler of systematic evil, using the sacraments of the church to wash blood from hands that had no intention of stopping their killing. But the worst part was the growing realization that his own life now hung by the thinnest of threads. He knew too much about the king's crimes, too much about the methods and motivations behind acts that the official histories would record as necessary policies or unfortunate accidents. He was no longer just a priest. He was a witness to regicide, treason, and murder on a scale that beggared imagination. And witnesses, as Benedict was beginning to understand, had a very short life expectancy in Edward's court. Over the following weeks, Benedict's morning confessions with the king became a routine of horror. Each dawn brought new revelations of cruelty, new admissions of calculated evil, new evidence that England was ruled not by a Christian monarch, but by a monster wearing a crown. The king spoke of bribing judges to condemn innocent men, of arranging the rape and murder of inconvenient witnesses, of using the church itself as a weapon against his enemies by having priests declare his opponents excommunicate or heretical. He described elaborate schemes to steal land from loyal nobles, to sell positions in government to the highest bidder regardless of their qualifications, and to manipulate food supplies to create artificial famines that would drive rebellious populations into submission. But perhaps most disturbing was Edward's casual mention of previous confessors and their fates. He spoke of Father Aldrich's unfortunate illness with the satisfaction of a man discussing a successful hunt. He referenced Father Matthew's accidental fall down the palace stairs as if it were a particularly clever joke, and he alluded to Father Gregory's choking death as an example of how God sometimes provided convenient solutions to earthly problems. "You see, Father Benedict," Edward explained during one particularly chilling confession, "the position of royal confessor requires a very specific type of man, someone with absolute discretion, unquestioning loyalty, and most importantly, the wisdom to understand that some secrets are too dangerous to carry for very long. The message was unmistakable. Benedict's predecessors had not died of natural causes or accidents. They had been murdered when the king decided they knew too much or had served their purpose. And Benedict himself was walking the same path toward the same inevitable end. The psychological toll was enormous. Benedict found himself unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to concentrate on his prayers. Every sound in the corridor outside his chamber made him freeze with terror. Every summons from the king felt like a potential death sentence. Every morning confession brought new horrors that had to be absorbed, processed, and sealed forever within his mind. But the worst part was the spiritual crisis that threatened to destroy his faith entirely. How could a just God allow such evil to flourish? How could the Church's sacraments be perverted into tools of oppression and murder? How could Benedict himself continue to grant absolution to a man whose sins cried out to heaven for vengeance? The answer, he gradually realized, was that God had not abandoned England, but God's representatives on earth had failed in their duty to confront evil and speak truth to power. The Church had become complicit in the king's crimes, providing spiritual cover for acts that should have resulted in excommunication and condemnation. Benedict began to understand that he faced not just a physical threat to his life, but a spiritual crisis that would determine the fate of his immortal soul. He could continue to enable the king's evil through the perverted sacrament of confession, or he could find the courage to act according to his true duty as a priest of Christ. But action in this case meant certain death, and Benedict was not yet ready to embrace martyrdom. The first sign that his time was running out came during the 4th week of his service. Benedict was returning to his chamber after attending Mass in the palace chapel when he encountered Sir William de Montfort, the king's chief enforcer and the man responsible for carrying out Edward's more unsavory commands. Sir William was a knight in name only. In practice, he was an assassin, torturer, and spy who served as the king's personal instrument of terror. "Father Benedict," Sir William said pleasantly, falling into step beside him, "how are you finding your new position? I trust the king's spiritual needs are not too burdensome." The question was casual, but Benedict could hear the underlying threat. Sir William was evaluating him, determining whether he had become a liability that needed to be eliminated. "His Majesty's confessions are a sacred trust," Benedict replied carefully. "I serve both King and God to the best of my ability." "Of course," Sir William agreed, "though I sometimes wonder whether the burden of such extensive spiritual guidance might prove overwhelming for some men. Father Aldrich, for instance, seemed to struggle with the weight of his responsibilities toward the end." "I was sorry to hear of Father Aldrich's illness," Benedict said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Illness, yes," Sir William mused. "A very sudden onset, as I recall. One day he seemed perfectly healthy, and the next he was delirious with fever, raving about sins and secrets and divine justice. Most unfortunate. The physician said his brain had been damaged by the illness, that he had lost the ability to distinguish between reality and fevered imaginings." Benedict understood the subtext perfectly. Father Aldrich had not succumbed to illness. He had been poisoned, probably with something that caused madness and death, while making it appear that any accusations he might make were the products of a diseased mind. It was an elegant solution to the problem of a confessor who might be tempted to break his vows of silence. "I pray that God will grant me the strength to serve faithfully for many years," Benedict said. "I'm sure you do," Sir William replied with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Though, of course, the position does require a certain flexibility in one's understanding of spiritual obligations. Men who become too rigid in their interpretations of church law sometimes find themselves in conflict with their duty to the crown. And we wouldn't want that, would we, Father?" After Sir William left him at his chamber door, Benedict sat on his narrow bed and tried to process what he had just heard. The king's enforcer was warning him that his life depended on his continued cooperation with the perversion of the sacrament of confession. Any sign of rebellion, any hint that he might refuse to continue granting absolution for unrepentant sins, would result in his immediate elimination. Benedict was trapped between two forms of damnation. He could continue to serve as the king's spiritual accomplice, using his priestly authority to enable evil while slowly corrupting his own soul. Or he could stand on principle and refuse to continue, knowing that such a stand would result in his death and accomplish nothing beyond the satisfaction of dying with a clear conscience. Neither choice offered salvation, and both led ultimately to destruction. That night, for the first time since taking his vows, Benedict seriously considered breaking the seal of confession. Perhaps if he could find a way to reveal the king's crimes without directly violating his priestly obligations, he could expose Edward's evil and rally opposition to his rule. Surely there were other nobles, other priests, other good Christians who would act if they knew the truth about their king. But even as the thought formed, Benedict recognized its futility. Who would believe him? Who would dare act against a king based on the word of a priest who had violated the most sacred trust of his office? And even if someone did believe him, what could they do? Edward commanded the loyalty of the army, controlled the treasury, and had spent years eliminating anyone who might pose a threat to his authority. The truth was that Benedict had been chosen precisely because he was powerless to act on what he learned. He was meant to serve as a repository for the king's sins, absorbing them and sealing them away where they could never be used against the crown. He was not a confessor but a spiritual garbage dump, collecting the filth of royal conscience and ensuring that it never saw the light of day. And when that repository became too full, or too dangerous, or simply too inconvenient, it would be emptied permanently. As winter deepened over London, Benedict's situation became increasingly desperate. The king's confessions grew ever more detailed and horrifying, as if Edward was testing his priest's ability to absorb and contain unlimited quantities of evil. He spoke of plans to eliminate entire noble families, to use the upcoming war with France as an excuse to seize church lands, and to establish a network of spies and informants that would make rebellion impossible for generations to come. But more disturbing still were the king's increasingly frequent references to the temporary nature of Benedict's position. Edward had begun making oblique comments about the need for fresh perspectives and spiritual guidance, about the danger of priests becoming too burdened by their responsibilities, and about his concern that prolonged exposure to royal sins might prove unhealthy for his confessors. The message was clear. Benedict's usefulness was approaching its expiration date, and the king was preparing to replace him with a new priest who could continue the charade without the inconvenience of having grown too familiar with Edward's methods and motivations. The end came sooner than Benedict had expected, and from a direction he hadn't anticipated. On a bitter January morning, as snow fell steadily outside the palace windows, King Edward arrived for his daily confession, carrying a small wooden box. He knelt at the confessional screen as usual, but instead of beginning with the traditional formula, he placed the box on the floor between them. "Father Benedict," the king said quietly, "I have a special confession to make today, one that requires a somewhat different approach than usual." Benedict's mouth went dry. "Your Majesty, open the box," Edward commanded. With trembling hands, Benedict lifted the lid and looked inside. Nestled in black velvet was a small glass vial filled with clear liquid, along with a piece of parchment folded into a neat square. He didn't need to examine the contents more closely to understand what he was seeing: poison and his own death warrant. "You see, Father," Edward continued conversationally, "I have sinned by planning the murder of someone who has become inconvenient to the smooth operation of my kingdom. Someone who knows too much, who has become too great a risk to leave alive, but whose death must appear natural and unremarkable." Benedict's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the vial. "Your Majesty, the poison is quite effective. Edward interrupted. Tasteless, odorless, and designed to mimic the symptoms of a natural fever. The victim becomes delirious within hours, speaking incoherently about imaginary threats and impossible conspiracies. Anyone listening would dismiss their words as the ravings of a sick mind. Death follows within a day, and the physicians always conclude that the brain fever was the cause. "Please, Your Majesty," Benedict whispered, "I have served you faithfully. I have kept your secrets. I have never—" "Indeed you have," Edward agreed, "and that faithful service has earned you a merciful death instead of the alternatives I might have chosen. Drink the poison now, during confession, and I will grant you absolution for all your sins before you die. Your soul will be clean, your death will appear natural, and your reputation will remain intact. It's far more than most men in your position receive." Benedict stared at the vial in his shaking hands. After all his fears, all his nightmares about how his life might end, the reality was almost anticlimactic. He was being ordered to murder himself during the sacrament of confession, with the promise of spiritual absolution as his reward for compliance. "And if I refuse?" he managed to ask. Edward's smile was genuinely amused. "Then Sir William will be summoned, and your death will be much less pleasant and much more public. You will be accused of attempting to poison me, tortured until you confess to crimes you never committed, and executed as a traitor. Your name will be cursed, your family will be stripped of their lands, and your soul will be damned for the sin of suicide, because that's how your death will be recorded if you force me to kill you." The choice was no choice at all, and they both knew it. Benedict could die quietly as a faithful priest who had succumbed to illness, or he could die screaming as a condemned traitor who had betrayed his king. Either way, he was going to die, and Edward would be free to find a new confessor who could be trusted to contain his secrets until he, too, became inconvenient. Benedict looked at the crucifix hanging on the wall of his chamber and offered a silent prayer for forgiveness, not for what he was about to do. He no longer had the luxury of choice in that matter, but for what he had failed to do during his weeks of service. He had enabled evil, sanctified sin, and allowed his priestly authority to be perverted into an instrument of oppression. He should have refused from the beginning. He should have found the courage to speak truth to power, regardless of the consequences. He should have chosen martyrdom over complicity, death over dishonor. Now it was too late for heroism. All that remained was the manner of his dying. "I understand, Your Majesty," Benedict said quietly. "May I have a moment to prepare my soul?" "Of course," Edward replied graciously. "Take all the time you need." Benedict knelt before his crucifix and made his final confession, not to the king, but to God himself. He confessed his cowardice, his complicity, his failure to live up to the sacred trust placed in him when he accepted his holy orders. He confessed his sin of silence in the face of evil, his participation in the corruption of the sacraments, and his betrayal of everything he had once believed about the purpose of his calling. But he also confessed his hope that God would understand the impossible position he had been placed in, would forgive a weak man who had tried to serve faithfully in circumstances no priest should ever have to face, and would grant mercy to a soul that had been caught between competing loyalties and had chosen the wrong one. When he finished his prayer, Benedict rose from his knees and picked up the vial. The liquid inside was perfectly clear, innocent-looking as water. It seemed impossible that something so simple could end a life, could silence a voice, could erase a soul from the world as if it had never existed. "I'm ready, Your Majesty," he said. Edward nodded approvingly. "Very good, Father. Now drink, and I will grant you absolution as you die. Your sins will be forgiven, your soul will be clean, and you will go to meet your God with a clear conscience." Benedict raised the vial to his lips, paused for a moment to make the sign of the cross, and drank the poison in a single swallow. The taste was indeed undetectable, but the effects began almost immediately. A burning sensation in his throat, followed by a strange tingling that spread throughout his body. His vision began to blur, and he felt himself swaying as he knelt before the confessional screen. Ego te absolvo, Edward intoned in perfect Latin, granting the absolution that would supposedly cleanse Benedict's soul as his body died. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Benedict tried to respond with the traditional Amen, but his voice was already failing. The poison was working quickly, more quickly than he had expected. His last coherent thought was a prayer that his death might somehow serve a purpose, that his silence might protect others from the horrors he had witnessed, and that God would judge him with mercy despite his failures. He collapsed to the floor of his chamber as King Edward watched with the detached interest of a natural philosopher observing an experiment. Within minutes, Benedict was convulsing and speaking incoherently, his words becoming increasingly jumbled and meaningless as the poison attacked his brain. By evening, Father Benedict Whitmore was dead, and the palace physicians were recording the cause of death as a sudden fever of the brain that caused delirium and rapid decline. His body was buried quietly in the Abbey cemetery, with a simple marker recording his faithful service to church and crown. Within a week, a new priest had been appointed to serve as the king's personal confessor, and the cycle began again. Father Thomas Ashford was 35 years old when he received the summons to serve as King Edward's personal confessor. Like Benedict before him, he believed the appointment was an honor, a recognition of his theological knowledge and spiritual wisdom. Like Benedict, he had no idea that he was walking into a death trap disguised as a promotion. Thomas lasted 6 months before the psychological toll became unbearable, and the king decided he had grown too familiar with royal secrets. His death was attributed to a fall from his chamber window during a sleepwalking episode, a tragedy that befell many troubled souls who carried burdens too heavy for mortal minds to bear. Father William de Clare succeeded Thomas and served for 8 months before succumbing to what appeared to be a sudden heart attack during his morning prayers. Father Hugh Mortimer lasted only 3 months before dying of what the physicians called a wasting disease of unknown origin. Father Simon of York endured for nearly a year before choking on his food during a solitary meal, an accident that seemed to befall an unusually large number of royal confessors. Each priest arrived at the palace believing he was different, stronger, more capable of handling the spiritual burden of serving a king who treated confession as a form of moral money laundering. Each discovered too late that the position was not about providing spiritual guidance, but about containing dangerous knowledge, until that knowledge became too dangerous to allow the container to survive. King Edward III ruled England for 50 years, and during that time, he employed over 40 different personal confessors. The turnover was remarkable even by medieval standards, but no one in authority questioned the pattern. The church hierarchy understood that royal service was dangerous, and the nobility learned not to inquire too closely into matters that might implicate them in inconvenient truths. The king himself seemed to age remarkably slowly for a man carrying such enormous spiritual burdens. Perhaps it was because he had found a way to transfer those burdens to others, using the sacrament of confession not to cleanse his soul, but to contaminate the souls of priests who were forced to absolve sins that cried out to heaven for vengeance. Or perhaps it was because Edward had long since lost any capacity for the kind of moral self-reflection that ages most men, having murdered his way to absolute power and maintained that power through systematic terror. He had achieved a state of spiritual numbness that protected him from the psychological consequences of his actions. But even kings must eventually face judgment, and Edward's came not from human justice, but from the divine justice he had spent his life mocking and perverting. In his final months, as age and illness finally began to claim him, Edward found himself unable to secure the services of a confessor. Word spread quietly through the church hierarchy that appointment as royal confessor was equivalent to a death sentence. Priests began finding excuses to avoid the summons, abbots stopped recommending candidates, and even the most ambitious clerics decided that some promotions were too dangerous to accept. For the first time in his adult life, King Edward III faced his sins without the comfort of sacramental absolution. As he lay dying in his royal chambers, surrounded by courtiers who waited eagerly for his death so they could divide his power among themselves, Edward called repeatedly for a priest to hear his final confession. None came. The man who had spent 50 years corrupting the sacrament of confession, who had turned priests into accomplices and the church into an instrument of oppression, died without the spiritual comfort he had denied to so many others. His last words, according to the few witnesses brave enough to record them, were a desperate plea for forgiveness that echoed unanswered through the cold stone chambers of Westminster Palace. Some said it was divine justice. Others claimed it was simply the logical result of a system based on fear and murder finally consuming itself. But the priests who had somehow survived Edward's reign understood the truth. The king had died as he had lived, alone with his sins and surrounded by the ghosts of those he had destroyed. The cycle of murder confessors ended with Edward's death, but the precedent he had established, that royal confessors were expendable instruments rather than spiritual advisors, would influence the relationship between church and crown for generations to come. And in the quiet chambers where priests still heard confessions, older clerics would sometimes warn younger ones about the dangers of serving too close to absolute power, reminding them that some honors were indistinguishable from death sentences, and that the seal of confession could become a shroud for those who agreed to carry secrets too dangerous for any mortal man to bear. The story of Father Benedict and his fellow martyrs was never officially recorded, never commemorated in any church calendar, never remembered in any prayer or hymn, but their sacrifice was not entirely forgotten. In the whispered warnings passed down through generations of priests, in the careful reluctance of clerics to serve too close to political power, and in the hard-won wisdom that some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, their memory lived on. They had died not as heroes, but as victims, not as martyrs, but as casualties of a system that treated human souls as expendable resources in the pursuit of absolute power. But in their deaths, they had revealed a truth that would outlast the kings who killed them and the kingdoms they served. Some secrets are bought with blood, some knowledge comes at the price of life itself, and some forms of service are indistinguishable from suicide. In the stone chambers of medieval palaces, where power and prayer intersected in the most dangerous ways, good men learned too late that serving God and serving earthly masters could lead to impossible choices. Sleep peacefully, knowing that throughout history, there have been those who carried unbearable burdens in silence, who paid the ultimate price for knowledge they never wanted to possess, who served faithfully even when faithfulness meant walking knowingly toward their own destruction. Let their memory remind us that some forms of loyalty demand everything and offer nothing in return, that some truths are too dangerous to speak and too evil to ignore, and that sometimes the greatest act of faith is simply enduring what cannot be changed. Close your eyes and rest, secure in the knowledge that even in the darkest chapters of human history, there were souls who chose to bear witness to evil rather than participate in it, who maintained their integrity even when that integrity doomed them, and who found the courage to die rather than live as accomplices to atrocity. The confessional booth stands empty now, its secrets buried with those who heard them, but the lesson remains. Some knowledge is a burden too heavy for any one person to carry, and some honors are indistinguishable from curses in disguise.